notice there are a number of people joining this webinar today, but I think it's time to get started. On behalf of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport in North America, which I will now refer to as CILTNA, I'd like to welcome you today to today's webinar presentation. A special thank you and welcome to our speaker today, Dr. Bill Anderson. He will be talking to us about the economic potential that is unleashed with the investment in major infrastructure. My name is Christine Burr, and I'm a member of CILTNA's Board of Directors and Chair of the Membership Committee. For the benefit of those unfamiliar with CILTNA, we're a professional body and the North American branch of the Chartered Institute of Logistics and Transport, which has 34,000 members in over 30 countries around the world. Our focus is on research, networking, education, and information sharing pertaining to logistics and transportation. We support the ongoing career development of our members, and it is with that in mind that we're offering this webinar today. And for the presentation today, we have 150 registrants located in around 16 countries around the world. It's important to stress that CILTNA's membership includes people working in all transportation modes and every sector within the industry, as well as with government and within academic institutions. Our speaker today is Dr. Bill Anderson. He's director of the Crossborder Institute at the University of Windsor in Canada. The Institute's research, outreach, and educational activities are focused on the movement of goods, people, and services across the Canada-US border, but also across other international land borders. Today's discussion will outline the kind of benefits that can arise when major new investments in infrastructure are made. Dr. Anderson will also flag what kind of policy considerations could be brought to bear by governments and industry in order to take advantage of some of these new installations. And now for a few housekeeping details. The presentation will take about 30 minutes, and we will then have some time for questions. Everyone is muted, and that is to ensure that there is as little distraction as possible for the speaker and the audience. We would ask that you stay muted and that you keep your video screen off as well, unless you are speaking. I invite you to provide questions through the chat facility at the bottom of your screen. And I'll do my best to collate the questions and have them ready for Bill at the end of his presentation. If you do get disconnected, just apply again to the Zoom address that you've already been using, and you should be able to get back into the webinar. The session's being recorded so that we can make it available afterward to webinar participants on the CILTNA YouTube channel. And right after the webinar, we will be sending out a survey. And I hope you'll take the time to fill in the survey because we rely on it a great deal in designing future webinars. And now I'm going to turn the presentation meeting over to Bill Anderson.
Okay, thanks, Chris. I'm going to be talking about the economic implications of infrastructure in the context of the Gordie Howe Bridge project. So we'll be talking about that as well. And really, before I can get onto it, I really need to talk about two things. One is the nature of infrastructure, and the other one is the nature of Canada-US trade. Because in this case, we're going to be talking about a piece of infrastructure that's there in large part to support Canada-US trade. First of all, the nature of infrastructure. There's a lot of debate in the United States right now about what's infrastructure and what isn't infrastructure. I'm not going to resolve any of those debates, but I will say what I mean when I talk about infrastructure today. First of all, we're talking about investments as opposed to sort of regular expenditures, investments in things that are going to yield longer term benefits. And this can be done as private infrastructure, but public infrastructure. And the focus today is mostly on public infrastructure. For public infrastructure, generally speaking, we're talking about a heterogeneous set of users. And so generally speaking, you talk about, say, an airport, you've got the business travelers, you've got the recreational travelers, you've got air cargo, and you talk about a highway, you know, you have the trucks, you have the cross-border traffic and the domestic traffic, you have the commuting people, and you have the people that are doing recreational trips. So usually we're talking about big facilities that serve a heterogeneous set of users. Now, when we talk about infrastructure, usually we talk about we used to say soft versus hard infrastructure. I prefer to say physical versus social infrastructure. And again, that's a topic that there's a lot of interesting discussion upon in the United States right now. I'm not going to get into that really today. I'm focusing on physical infrastructure. But when I say physical infrastructure, I don't just mean concrete and asphalt, because physical infrastructure does not just involve the sort of concrete footprint of an infrastructure facility, but rather also things like air traffic control. If you think about air traffic control, what does it do? It essentially makes it possible to move more airplanes through a given amount of airport infrastructure. So it's technology that's basically expanding the capability of the infrastructure. Intelligent transportation systems is a similar story. And specifically, I want to talk about network infrastructure. And network infrastructure are things that connect places. So they could be, water and sewage infrastructure generally in a network, certainly electricity transmission and distribution, pipelines, network to connect, the source of where you might have natural gas and a fertilizer plant, or where you have oil and a refinery, et cetera, and rail and road networks. I'm going to be focusing on road networks. One thing I want to emphasize, however, is when you talk about network infrastructure, you're not only connecting places, but you're also creating corridors. Corridors essentially are when you make the connection between two places that are at some distance, you are also making it possible to extend that service to facilities or people that are located along that link, okay? And so corridors tend to develop with network infrastructure. And so eventually what you see is a pattern of economic activity that is not necessarily the same pattern for which the infrastructure was developed in the first place. Network infrastructure has a tendency to transform the economic landscape. I'm just trying to get a lot of things coming on my screen and I can't see my own slides. Hopefully you're not seeing some of the things I'm seeing on my screen right now. But anyway, when we look at historical cases, well, first of all, what's infrastructure for? Transportation infrastructure is there to improve accessibility. And I always like to say accessibility rather than mobility, because we're not just talking about moving around, it's being able to reach places that are some economic benefit to you. And so improved accessibility generally leads to increased economic potential. And we can see a lot of historic examples of this. And probably the most famous example of this would be, we look at the transcontinental railways. And the transcontinental railways, if you read the history of it, very much what they had in mind was making the connection between the existing centers of population on the east and the west coast, in either Canada or in the United States. But the outcome was to create corridors of high accessibility that were then useful for commercial agriculture, because you have good agricultural land, but it doesn't, it's not developable if you're not able to get the goods to market. The Great Lakes locks and canals, it's just a fascinating story. Between about 1824 and 1855, there was the development of all these locks and canals that made the Great Lakes navigable from way out in Duluth, Minnesota, all the way through out to the port of Montreal, and also because of the Erie Canal down to the port of New York. That essentially created not just accessibility of those places for export, but also a connectivity among the different places there, which, for example, made it possible to get iron ore to places where you could get coal, so you could develop a steel industry. And the steel industry historically is generally the basis of any great industrial center. So I would make the argument that the development of the greatest industrial region that the world had ever seen was highly dependent on the infrastructure that was done to make it possible to navigate. The point about that is, you can look on the map and say, oh, good, I can sail from Lake Erie into Lake Ontario, but the problem is you'd have to sail over Niagara Falls to do that. Obviously, you can't do that, and so they had to dig the Welland Canal so that you could bypass Niagara Falls. And what does infrastructure do for you? Well, it reduces travel times, and you can think of that as time is money. So if you reduce travel times, then you're going to reduce your costs. I also like to think about it as time as distance. And you can use the example of, say, going across the border at some place like the Detroit River. And let's say that you had delays, you had congestion and various things that were making it take an hour to cross the border. And incidentally, it does not take an hour to cross the border on average, much less than that. But let's just say it did. You can think of that as effectively meaning that the Detroit River is 100 kilometers wide, okay? Because getting across that river is the same thing as covering 100 kilometers of territory. So in that sense, the fascinating thing about infrastructure is that it basically changes your geography. It basically brings places closer together. Now, if you have fully connected infrastructure networks, you're no longer, doing the sort of greenfield types of things that we do with, say, the railroads. But there are other things you can do, which is, for example, reduce circuity. And that just basically means if you add more links to a network where everything is already connected, you can make more direct connections. You also reduce congestion delays. And a very important thing about infrastructure improvements on a network is that they reduce uncertainty. Okay, and I'm going to come back to that issue as I go through this today. And I want to just say one thing before I get off this slide. It's something that I won't say enough about today. And you can say I almost forgot to say it now. Bear in mind that when we use those historical examples of something like Transcontinental Railway, it was a very positive thing for the people that got economic benefits from it. It was also arguably a very negative thing for Indigenous people. And so in this case, as in many cases, infrastructure development doesn't benefit everyone. Sometimes that there are those that benefit and those that suffer a cost from it, okay? And again, that's a topic I really can't get into in the time we have today. Now, I want to talk a little bit about US-Canada trade, because when we talk about the Gordie Howe Bridge project, the big issue there is with respect to US-Canada trade. First of all, I know there's people from, I think, 14 or 15 different countries on today. One thing a lot of people don't realize is that Canada-US trade, for much of the last 50 years, has been the largest bilateral trade relationship on earth. And in 2019, the last time I looked at these numbers, it was number 2, just behind US-Mexico, which is kind of caught up with US-Canada, and 3 times as much as US trade with Japan or Germany. So this is a huge trade relationship. Canada is the #1 market for US exports. And 58% of merchandise trade moves by trucks, okay? And this is a unique characteristic of, but not just this trade relationship, but what I'm about to talk about as supply chain trade relationships. It's mostly manufactured goods. So people get the wrong impression that the trade between Canada and the United States is mostly commodities from and coming from Canada and manufactured goods going back from the United States to Canada. It's not the case. In both directions, it's mostly manufactured goods. And a lot of intra-industry trade. So you see a lot of trade, for example, going both directions in the automotive industry. About half of the trade is in and out of the province of Ontario. The province of Ontario is very, very big relative to the Canadian economy overall. And because the Gordie Howe Bridge connects to Ontario, I'm going to be a little bit focused on the province of Ontario. And that trade going in and out of the province of Ontario around the Great Lakes is 75% by truck, so really dominated by truck. The biggest categories there are automotive and machinery and electrical equipment. And really what we're seeing is cross-border supply chains. And most of that trade in trucks goes through just a handful of border crossings. And so the infrastructure at those border crossings is really important. Now, I want to talk about the general concept of supply chain trade. It's trade in cross-border industrial supply chains. And generally it means trade in intermediate goods, or you can think of this as factory to factory trade. So instead of you producing something at a factory and selling it to the final consumer in another country, you're selling it to another factory in another country as part of the supply chain before the good ultimately gets to the final consumer. A lot of the trade is that. Also, a lot of the trade is the export of final goods containing substantial value from the receiving country. So that would be, for example, something like if you have a car that's shipped from Canada to the United States, typically a lot of the components in that car would have been produced in the United States. And so they would have been in that category of the trade in intermediate goods. And so what you're seeing is most of the things that are going back and forth across the border are not the result of independent supply chains on one side of the border or the other. And the textbook example is the North American automotive industry. When you go and you read articles in economics journals about supply chain trade, Usually in the first paragraph, they talk about the North American automotive industry as being the sort of quintessential example of supply chain trade. Now, the thing about supply chain trade is that on a global scale, it's regional, okay? What that means is that we think of trade as goods going all over the world and, goods crossing the oceans and whatnot. The supply chain trade, which, by different calculations, accounts for something like a third of all international trade, is very much concentrated in a few global clusters, particularly in North America, US, Canada, Mexico, in Europe, among the countries of the European Union, and among a handful of countries in Asia. Okay, so it's relatively trade over short distances, and it has a big influence. When you look overall at trade figures and how far things go, most people say, boy, things don't move as far in international trade as I thought they do. And it's because so much of it is this supply chain trade. And for this reason, the trade logistics, supply chain trade logistics looks a lot more like domestic logistics, supply chain logistics. Speed and reliability are in most cases more important than the absolute minimization of costs. So the highway mode dominates, okay? So that's the nature of trade between the United States and Canada, and that's really underlies everything that we'd be saying here. Now, what are the sectors where this happens? And just quickly, I'll say automotive is the big sector where it happens. There's a lot that happens in agri-food, but there's also a lot of room for expansion and integration of supply chain in agri-food. Retail supply chains are relatively poorly integrated, but there's a great potential there. I think something we should be looking at now is those types of supply chains that are critical for resilience. And many of you will be familiar with the executive order on America's supply chains that President Biden issued a few months ago now. And it has to do with things like PPE, critical minerals, and whatnot. These are the types of supply chains that can run across an international border like the United States and Canada, but probably it's preferable not to have those supply chains operate on a global scale. That's basically the implication of that executive order. And in many cases in that executive order, the president talks about you can have these supply chains either making them completely domestic or through integration with partners and friends that share our values and share our interests. And so there's a lot of scope for expansion of Canada-US supply chain trade, in my view. Here's just a picture that talks about the modes. The modal share of road for Canada-US trade is almost 60%, where it's a relatively small share when we're talking about Canada's trade with the rest of the world. So the implication, all this, I've taken up a lot of my time to make one point to you, and that is Canada-US trade does not look like this. Canada-US trade looks like this, okay? I'm messing this up. Okay, that's what Canada-US trade looks like, okay? And it's goods moving in trucks, and it's moving through a relatively small number of border crossings. What we see here is a picture of the Ambassador Bridge. The Ambassador Bridge is the #1 crossing for Canada-US trade. We see this long line of trucks. It doesn't look like this every day. It's usually not this congested, but I showed these pictures to kind of give you a feeling of what the volume of this trade is. In our report, there's a calculation we did that shows that if you take the size of all of those containers that are basically the trunk boxes here, the volume of all of those cargo areas is greater than the volume of containers that go through the port of Vancouver. So this is a gigantic trade that takes place. And a lot of people look at this and they say, oh, it's messy, it's horrible. Actually, I love it. I love trucks, so I love it. But here's the point. Every one of those trucks came from the address from which the goods were being produced, if it's an intermediate good, and they're going directly to the address where those goods are going to be taken into the production process of another company. The trucks were dispatched according to the time that was convenient for the shipper and not for the time that was set in the schedule of the carrier. And so it means that you have so much more flexibility in this type of supply chain trade if you use trucks. And so there are environmental issues, a lot of issues to be addressed, but I don't think there's going to be a major shift away from using trucks anytime in the future. Where is this taking place? Just very quickly, this is a map of all of these crossings between the United States and Canada and the eastern part of the continent. All of those locations that would look like what I just showed you would be just at these three crossings at the St. Clair, Detroit, and Niagara River. This is the Detroit River crossing, and this is where we're going to be focused now for the rest of this talk. Here's a picture of what it looks like in terms of the actual truck flows. And these are data that we generate by looking at the GPS records of a sample of about 50,000 trucks. And you assemble those GPS records and you make them into origin destination. We do a lot of that at the Crossborder Institute. If anybody's interested in learning more about that, get in touch with me and I will send you technical papers on that get into how we do that. But essentially what I want to emphasize in looking at this is when you see these big truck flows, so the big thick purple line, this is going over the North Shore of Lake Ontario through the Greater Toronto area and down towards the Detroit River crossing. The amazing thing is that normally what you would expect to see is for these lines to sort of peter out as they approach the border because the cross-border trade would be so much smaller than the domestic trade, okay? What you see is that those lines remain as thick as they cross the border than they are in other parts of the map. And that is a very interesting indication of the amount of integration that there is in these freight movements in supply chains between the United States and Canada. Now, the Detroit River crossing, just to focus on the Detroit River crossing, and I'm already conscious of my time, so I'm gonna skip through a few things here. I'm gonna give you things that have all the details that you can look at. But the Ambassador Bridge, it accounts for about a third of Canada-US truck-borne trade and about almost a fifth of the total trade between the United States and Canada. It connects up a major highway that comes from Greater Toronto area, the 401, with the interstates, I-75, I-96, 994 in the United States. So here's what I really want to make the point here. You need to think about this crossing not as a thing in itself. You think about it as a nexus of a North American highway infrastructure system. Okay, so it's network infrastructure system. If you consider this one network, it gets held together at a few points at the Detroit River, the St. Clair River, or the Niagara River. It's the main connection for the automotive industry, but it has problems. It has limited capacity in terms of lanes on the bridge. It has constrained inspection plazas. The infrastructure itself, which has done incredible service and is still very useful, but is 90 plus years old. And until recently, there was no direct highway connection on the Canadian side, so that you didn't have a highway to highway connection. So linking up the highways was incomplete. You had to go onto roads with signalized intersections to basically get to from the Canadian highway network into this crossing. When we look at the shipments that go across at the Ambassador Bridge or the Detroit River crossing, we see that they have a pattern. They're not just local, they spread out all over the United States, but you definitely see this north-south pattern kind of follows the I-75, and a lot of that is the automotive trade, okay? So that when you look at this pattern, it's not so much driven by the pattern of consumer demand as it is driven by the patterns of industrial activity. On the Canadian side, this map's a little bit harder to look at, so I will leave it. You're gonna be able to get this PDF and you can look at this at your leisure, but you see that what you have is a flow of trucks. You know, what do these maps mean? I think it was a sample of 250,000 trucks that went across the Ambassador Bridge, where they come from and where they're going, as simple as that. And we see that there are many going all the way to Montreal. In fact, there are as many trucks using the Ambassador Bridge at the Detroit River crossing from the Montreal area as there are from the Southwest Ontario area down here, okay? So this is a real nexus point in this network, this highway network, which is basically what supports what is now the second largest bilateral trade relationship on earth. So that tells you how important that particular crossing is. And I have maps of other crossings and you can take a look at those. They're in the report. Now, the Gordie Howe International Bridge Project. This is a new highway-to-highway crossing the Detroit River. And really what it's there for is, I would say, three things: efficiency, reliability, and redundancy. Efficiency from the perspective of, generally speaking, being faster and smoother. Reliability in the sense that you don't have as much variation in the crossing times from day to day. And our research has definitely indicated that the problems from the logistics perspective is not so much in just on average how long it takes to get across the border, but it's the variability from day to day and how long it takes to get across the border. And it provides redundancy. It's not right to think that the Gordie Howe Bridge is a project that's there to replace the Ambassador Bridge. What we want to see is two bridges across the Detroit River, so that ultimately, if one bridge has a problem, the other bridge is still available. That's what we mean by redundancy. I have a little information here about the history and the contracting of this project. It's one of the biggest P3 contracts in the world right now. It consists of not just, if we look at this map, here's what it looks like. This is the Detroit River. This is where the current bridge is, the Ambassador Bridge. It's downriver from that, and you have these very large port of entry facilities on either side. And before we could even do this, we needed a highway to connect to the end of the major highway system in Ontario so that this becomes a highway-to-highway connection. And here you connect right onto the I-75, which is one of the major interstate highways in the United States, which has a very critical role in a number of industries, especially the automotive industry. Here's the artist's rendition of what it'll look like. There's be a cable stay bridge. You can see there's a very large inspection plaza in the foreground. And then in the background, you can see the Ambassador Bridge, which is not very far away. But essentially, that's not a bad thing. That's a good thing because that gives you the redundancy. And it reduces the risk that you would ever have a situation where there wasn't adequate connection for Canada-US trade. We did a study at the Crossborder Institute with a number of colleagues also from Michigan. And I'm giving you the links to this study. There's a full report and a summary report. I hope since most of the people are logistics people here today, they're interested in these things, you look at the full report because most of the stuff that will interest you is in the full report and not just the summary report. But I can't go into all of the details that are there today, but this will give you a picture, if you look at it, of what we found in terms of trying to look at the characteristics and the economic impacts of this new project. I want to shout out to my co-authors, and I saw one of them sign on here, Dan Lynch and Roger Hamlin, both from Michigan, Bob Armstrong, still in his own, Bob Armstrong, of course, and Laurie Tanous from the Crossborder Institute. Now, this has a funny title. It's called the Assessing Economic Impacts and Opportunities. What do we mean by impacts and opportunities? Isn't that the same thing? Well, no, we're making a distinction between impacts, which are the benefits, or it could be costs, that are realized automatically when the infrastructure comes into service. And that could be things like time savings. So as soon as you get the new bridge, you can use the new bridge and you're gonna have a time savings. Increased reliability, an increase or decrease in emissions, depending upon how that trade-off between emissions and congestion and emissions from a larger flow plays out. But those things just happen automatically when you open the bridge. But a lot of the economic benefits don't just happen. They require some activities. And so opportunities refers to new economic activities for which the infrastructure is a necessary but not sufficient condition. So when Chris was talking about the policy implications, that's where this comes in. The question is now you've got this increased connectivity, this increased accessibility. How do you take advantage of that? Okay, now to some extent, the market will take care of it. But there may be certain types of economic developments that are going to require some intervention at different levels of government and the participation of major private sector players. So here we're talking about trade-induced investment in newer expanded capacity, and especially activities that complement the improved transportation service. And you'll see I'm going to talk about transportation, distribution, and logistics activities as an example of that. Now, we talk about those impacts. Why will this be an improvement? Well, some of these things are pretty obvious. A highway-to-highway connection and in improved corridors. Okay, here's the key thing. I say highway-to-highway connection and improved corridors. We look at this map here. And this is just a map. I just did a Google map directions from Toronto to Dayton. Okay, and this is. I hope you can see my. No, maybe I can't. Yeah, I hope you can see my cursor here. But this is where the new bridge is, right around here where it says 7 hours and 6 minutes. And this is the Highway 401 coming down from the Greater Toronto area and the I-75 coming up from Dayton. Now, we have the improvement of the bridge, so you get a better connection. But the point is, both of those corridors have been having major improvements for quite a long time now. And if you drive this, you're going to be cursing at all the construction goes on. But you curse at the construction that goes on now, but that's going to improve the performance of that highway in the future. So before, what we had was a major improvement to a highway corridor taking place in Canada, major improvement in the United States, but we still had substandard infrastructure connecting them up. Essentially, what this project does is connect up this entire corridor so that now you have a major improvement overall in a trade corridor that's one of the most critical components of Canada-US trade. Other things here, larger inspection plaza, there'll be more lanes. There's a number of reasons why more lanes is beneficial, not just because you can support more volume, but if there's an incident, it doesn't lead to as much congestion. And also we have things like the trusted traveler and the trusted trader designations. You can give those people or those trucks their own lane, and so they get a benefit from it. Advanced technology is another one, but I want to really just not necessarily, basically just want to make a big point about this last one. The certainty of long service lifetime supports private investment. When we talk to people in industry, a lot of times they say, oh yeah, we're interested in going into the United States, or we're interested in going into Canada. But we're a little bit worried because if we start stretching our supply chains across the border, what happens if the infrastructure isn't there at some point in the future? So if people are going to make the investments in plant that is necessary to produce goods that are going to be part of Canada-US trade, they have to be certain that they're going to have the infrastructure there to support their logistics in the future. This bridge, which has a lifetime of actually more than 100 years, but certainly 100 years, is clearing up any uncertainty about that. And that's going to be, I think that's one of the main benefits that come from this project. When we say benefits, what do we mean? Well, an impact, it could be positive or negative. If it's positive, it's a benefit. Why do you build infrastructure? To try to create benefits, and of two types. Static benefits mean better transportation service to the existing pattern of border traffic flows. So aggregate time savings. And if you look at our report, there's a lot of information about aggregate time savings. But in the longer term, the dynamic benefits say that superior service gives rise to a change pattern of trade flow. If you're basically reducing in a permanent way the cost of trading across the border, that is the same thing as eliminating a tariff. It's the same impact, okay? It's a cost that you're going to incur if you sell or source across the border that you're not going to incur if you stay domestic. And so in the same sense that we were so excited and so worried about the renegotiation of NAFTA and all of that took place, we should be very excited about this because this is doing the same type of thing. It's reducing the friction in Canada-US trade and creating new opportunities for trade. It's expanding existing trade. I'm going to show you a couple of graphs here. And again, time doesn't permit me to go into this in too much detail, but these graphs, if you look at the report, what we do is these calculations that look at a particular industry like motor vehicle manufacturing, we say, well, if you had an assembly plant in any of these locations, we break the region into 1,000 different zones, for which we have quite a bit of, we have data by industry and all of that type of stuff. We have network distances between all of the different zones. And so this is the type of stuff we do at our traffic lab at Crossborder Institute. But basically we're saying, how much closer effectively are you getting to your suppliers in terms of the savings of time that you will have when this bridge goes in place, okay? And so that's what this graph shows. We also, and I apologize for putting something I can't possibly explain, but for people that are interested in this sort of thing, we have a computable general equilibrium model that tries to see that everything else being equal, if you reduce those costs of going across Canada-US border with this project, how much expansion in trade do you expect to see? Okay, and it's a very, very complex, it's a lot of work to answer that simple question. This graph basically shows you the industries where we expect that to take place. It all makes sense. And there's details about that report for the people that are interested in that. Now, the opportunities side, we sort of focused, we wanted, especially working with Dan and Roger from Michigan, we wanted to find a kind of opportunity that would be in sort of close to the bridge in southwestern Ontario and southeast Michigan. And after a lot of research and consultation, and we talked to a couple of hundred people altogether on this project, we found that transportation, distribution, logistics was going to be the best thing that you could try to promote to take advantage of the huge flow of trade that's going through this corridor. For a number of reasons, it's land intensive, and land is a little bit more available and a little bit less expensive in this area than it is in some other metro areas. It's a great industry to grow if you have a lot of people working in manufacturing, and they're very skilled people, but they're not transferable skills. And if you're shedding jobs in manufacturing, transportation, distribution, logistics is a place people can go. It enhances the competitiveness of the region. And we get into this discussion in the report, but basically I would make the argument that this border crossing is an ideal location for sort of hub services, sort of cross-docking type activities. And so we think that there's a great potential to expand transportation, distribution, and logistics activities in this region. And this is where the opportunity comes in, though, because the opportunity, it won't necessarily just happen by itself. There needs to be probably some sort of an institution or some sort of an organization with the participation of governments that will kind of kickstart this thing, because it's the type of thing that can benefit many different companies, many different people, but there isn't necessarily enough in it for any one company to take the whole thing on themselves. Okay, we discussed that quite a bit. Maybe that maybe come up in the question and answer, but we make some recommendations on coming up with some sort of an action plan, things that you shouldn't do. No development on spec. There's a lot of situations around North America where people have promoted some sort of a logistics center and it wasn't in the right place. And the result is to get buildings on spec that remain empty for a long time. Basically, the idea here is that we would try to bring people from the logistics community together with different levels of government, basically to pursue that opportunity, the thing that can happen because of the bridge, but won't happen automatically. Okay, so in this case, the bridge is a necessary condition, but not a sufficient condition for that type of economic development. So just to kind of round up on the study itself, we have, I think the best way, the way I like to think about this is that the Gordie Howe International Bridge Project represents one of the most important initiatives for trade facilitation in the world today. When you consider the volume of the trade that's going on here and the effect it will have on, and by the way, I did a study together with some people at Transport Canada a few years ago that basically said it's costing you an extra 15 to 40% in trucking costs if the trucks have to get across the border, as opposed to if they were moving the same goods the same distance domestically. Okay, so trade facilitation, if we can squeeze that down so that this premium you have to pay to cross the border can be smaller, then this is a major trade facilitation. It will save billions in the current traffic, improving cross-border accessibility, facilitating trade, and there is the opportunity created for the development of a new cluster of logistics activities in the region and along that entire corridor. You know, if you think about that picture that I showed you before of going from Toronto to Dayton, if we now think of this as a high quality, super high quality infrastructure corridor, there's a lot of opportunities for development along that corridor. Okay, so I think in light of the time, I'm going to stop now and I'm looking forward to your questions. Chris, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Bill. I was trying to undo my video. I seem to be blacked out at the moment, but anyway, you can hear me, so that's the main thing.
I have unblocked it, Chris.
Okay, great. We have a question from Joshua Billington asking about rural redundancies. And Joshua says, we've seen the impact of pandemics and social disruption in urban centers. And is there any possibility for increased urban diffusion to rural areas where those less traveled trade corridors could be engaged?
Yeah, I do think that's, the dispersion of various economic activities to rural areas is one of those corridor elements. So when we're talking about corridors, the reason it's important, we're looking at network infrastructure to think about corridors. Is one of the things is that you can have development in relatively rural areas. I wouldn't want to, however, I don't want to underestimate the problems of getting some of these developments off the ground in rural areas, because having the accessibility, so being relatively close to that highway, but if you think about it, it's basically, if you're on that highway in the corridor, it basically means that you have very good access to major cities that are also in that corridor. So that's the advantage. Problem is often with labor resources. And so it's one piece of the puzzle with respect to rural development and things other than agriculture, but it's not the whole story, because you need to have the labor resources to make certain types of economic activities work. But certainly we see, there are lots of areas, industrialized areas that we see around the Great Lakes today that were 50 years ago or 100 years ago rural areas, and it was possible for that development to take place because the highway network ties everything together. I don't know if that answered your question or not. I hope so.
Yeah, thanks, Bill. I have a question here from John Coleman. If cross-border truck traffic increases with the new bridge, which seems likely, would you foresee a decrease in cross-border freight rail traffic?
I think the substitutability there is a little lower than most people think. And John is very familiar with John and I do a little jog and pony show occasionally on training. So John's very familiar with this. I think the substitutability is limited. And so there's not that much on rail that would make a lot of sense to come off onto the highways. Yeah, you would expect there to be some substitution effect. You would expect to see some of it happening. But another way to look at this is if you expand overall the Canada-US trade, the infrastructure makes a contribution to expanding the Canada-US trade, especially in some of the areas that I've mentioned. You could have more integration of retail supply chains. Definitely those supply chains and things like PPE, I mean, that's the example we always use, but there's many other things like that that have a major resilience issue, and there's an effort to do nearshoring. If you have that overall expansion in Canada-US trade, I think the net effect of that would be an expansion in Canada-US rail shipments as well, because they're complementary. There are certain things you do by rail. For example, you make cars, you bring all of the components to the assembly plant, but you put most of those cars on rail to ship them out because they're going very long distances, and that makes sense, right? So consequently, if you, as a result of having the bridge, you've got better logistics services available, and that leads to having another assembly plant someplace in Ontario, the outcome would be a very significant increase in the total amount of rail activity going back across the border between Ontario and Michigan.
Bill, I'd like to change the direction slightly for a moment. We have a number of people registered online today who are from other countries. And I know that some of them might be curious to know whether the economic benefits that you see accruing from the project, the Gordie Howe project, would this be similar for an infrastructure investment in a regional or state context? What should they be thinking about?
Yeah, I think in general, in many, the Crossborder Institute, we tend to focus sort of on land border crossings as opposed to, ports and airports and those types of things. And maybe it's self-serving, but I think that land border crossings are becoming more important in the global economy, and especially to the extent that you start to have regionalization. Take Africa, for example, and I did see that there was some people attending from Africa. I mean, the story in Africa has historically been, and I'm not completely up to date on the numbers, but I think this is still true, that the amount of trade among African states, which would potentially be across land borders, is much less than the potential that's there. And it's partly colonial legacy, the fact goods from the interior to ports and not from one country to another. And so the integration, if you think about the European Union, there's a huge amount of integration. We spent some time in Poland recently, and you can see how you have the integration of the Polish industry with the German industry now, in the automotive and a lot of other industries like that. To get that sort of integration, and of course, and the textbook example of that is Canada and the United States. To get that sort of integration in Africa, which I think would be very positive for the economy overall in Africa, you need to have the infrastructure, and the infrastructure has to be across the land borders rather than just everything being focused on the ports and on infrastructure systems that move goods from the interior to the ports. So I think there's a lot of lessons that can be taken from the Canada-US case that are quite applicable in Africa, also in the ASEAN states, for example. You now have a lot of growth taking place in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar, and you've got a lot of potential movement, Thailand, potential movement across the land borders, and needing to have that infrastructure that allows you to have that sort of supply chain trade. And basically the idea here is that the whole region generating larger scale supply chains is going to be more competitive on a global basis than each country trying to have all of the supply chains located completely within their own borders. So that's as a sort of high-level geopolitical type of issue. I think all of these issues related to infrastructure that we see in North America, Canada and the United States, and definitely Canada and Mexico, same story, are very applicable with things that are going on in other parts of the world. Central America is another great example, where the types of infrastructure improvements that we've seen in North America over the years, I think could yield great benefits.
That's great. Thanks, Bill. We know that technologies are evolving very quickly in transportation and logistics. How do government border agencies stay on top of the rapidly set of technology within the supply chain world?
I was having a little trouble hearing. There was some strange noise over there, but I think I got, basically it's the question of with all of the technologies, how does government take advantage of that?
Especially border agencies.
Yeah, especially the border agencies. And I have one very strong opinion on that, and that is government does not take advantage of that technology by trying to invent new things themselves. I think that if you wanted to improve border crossings, the greatest potential is to look at what's already going on out there in the logistics world. Now, logistics has undergone this tremendous technological transformation in the last, it's not that recent anymore. It's really been going on for a decade. And there is so much security-based type equipment, tracking equipment, et cetera, so many technologies there. What you don't need is for government agencies to try to invent their own tracking type thing. Sometimes you want to create some sort of a standard, and it can take years to get the United States and Canada to agree on a particular standard, whether it's for a seal for a truck box or something like that. You really want to see what people are already using. Okay, because rather than asking people in this industry to go out and spend money on equipment that's mandated by the government agencies, when they already are much more sophisticated themselves in things like supply chain security, I think the important thing is for government to get together with industry and figure out how to
Could people please mute themselves so we can hear the speaker? Thank you.
For government to get together with industry and figure out, okay, what are you doing that would be useful from the perspective of our border functions? And of course, naturally, there are some things, and actually, I mean, I would say in a way, the Canadian government has had a lead in this in something like the customs self-assessment system, which basically says we're going to go directly into the IT systems of the corporation to do customs accounting. And I think if you can extend that model to other things, it's a much more productive way to develop technology for government applications than trying to have a think tank and invent things from scratch.
One last question here, Bill, and then we'll wrap up. Adam Pernasilici, I hope I'm pronouncing that properly, Adam, is asking what kind of labor resources do you foresee US CBP and CBSA appropriating to the new bridge? I'm sure you can't forecast appropriations, but you may be able to comment on the kind of labor expertise, the kind of job potential for people working at border crossings in the future.
Right. Well, I think the first thing is that there's no question that there's an issue of staffing. If you're now going to have two ports of entry, for example, going into the United States, are they both going to be staffed? And the answer from the agencies in the past has been yes, but they, in terms of sort of great clouds on the horizon and things that, you need to look out for to make sure that we get the full potential of this new infrastructure is to deal with this whole question of staffing. And of course, staffing is very, it's a very expensive part of border operations. And there's a lot of things that you can do, green lanes and things like that, to make more efficient use of the staff that's already in the ports of entry, so that you between now and the time in 2024 when the bridge opens, you don't necessarily have to increase the total staff at the Windsor-Detroit crossing, but rather to make some good labor savings adjustments, and at the same time make sure that the main thing is you want to get all the lanes open, right? And I think everybody in the industry, that's what they want to see, and that's what they're worried about. So I think that's a big issue. I certainly think that as the technology develops, and it's going to be just like logistics in general. I used to think about that as an industry that was not, a techie type of industry. Now it definitely is. I think that border management and border operations are going to become one of the most technologically advanced components of government services. And so, I think people know that. I mean, I think people at CBSA and CBP and DHS know that. I think as we go forward, it's going to require the willingness to take some big leaps with respect to the way things are done in border crossings. That incrementalism is good, but in order to take advantage of technological changes, sometimes you have to make a bit of a leap, and that's a very, very difficult thing to do at a border crossing. Because you've got this constant flow of traffic, and you can't just say, oh, starting Monday morning, we're going to do everything differently. And so there's challenges there, but I do think we will see a much more technologically advanced border crossing with a different range of employment opportunities in the next 10 years or so.
Thank you very much, Bill, and thank you for sharing your findings with us today. This has been a fascinating overview of how a large infrastructure project can actually lead to greater opportunities over time. And I think it's an exciting message for governments and industry. And hopefully they will be positioned to take advantage of some of the opportunities that are going to arise with the creation of a new crossing at Windsor-Detroit. Thank you to everyone who took the time to join the Chartered Institute for this webinar. And thanks to all of you who posed questions. Sorry we didn't get a chance to cover all of them, but there was a lot of interest in what Bill had to say, and I hope we hit some of the highlights. I'd like to remind you as well, if you've been enjoying the webinar series that we've been offering during the pandemic, we would invite you to consider joining the Chartered Institute and becoming a member of a worldwide network of people interested in transportation and logistics. And closer to home, we would invite you to send in your comments on our survey, which you will be receiving shortly. Please take the time to give us some feedback, because we strive constantly to improve this webinar series, and we really appreciate the feedback that people send us. Thank you again to everyone who participated, and thank you so much, Bill, for sharing this presentation with us. It was truly excellent. And
Thank you.
we look forward to hearing more in the future as you continue to monitor the growth in this exciting corridor. Thank you very much, everybody. Have a good rest of your day wherever you may be located.